So we know that there is a significant development underway. Infrastructure Ontario puts together a lot of development, and they are trying to build a civic-minded provincial-style courthouse. And these, of course, could be fantastic new monuments that will have to speak and represent the language of justice. And for those who are seeking justice, this particular structure will have to project a certain neutrality. You're not really supposed to have a symbol of justice that's going to be weighted too much in representation of culture and history. And I learned this recently because I was speaking with Infrastructure Ontario staff about the public realm connections around the space. So how do we treat Centre, Chestnut, Armory, and I dare even say Dundas? How do we actually provide, how do we take this opportunity to take what we now have uncovered to make sure that the public realm, with respect to this 135-meter structure, this new provincial courthouse, is going to somehow speak to the history of the past, and not just architecturally, but also historically and culturally. And I was advised that courthouses, as they are designed, must speak with neutrality. So they have to be unbiased. And the reason I bring this up is because I asked whether or not we can actually take the reconciliation recommendations, and there's 94 of them for those who read the report. Can we actually create some placemaking by paying attention to the history of Canada's first people whose land that we sit on? Can we actually put that into some type of design, the architectural design of the courthouse? And my friends from Infrastructure Ontario are here because you'll remember this conversation. And I was advised it has to be neutral. So then we start to explore, well, can we do it on the streets if you can't do it on the courthouse for that reason? And yet at the same time, it's specifically the history, I think, that we now have uncovered, which is the history of the 150 years of built form history, 150 years of post-contact history that we're now going to spend a lot of time commemorating, which is important, but I would say that it's probably just as important to pay homage to the history that is very difficult to uncover, and where we may not have the representation of the tens of thousands of pieces of artifacts that speak to the Indigenous history. So can we do that through new interpretation through built form along the street, and whether or not we can actually extend that beyond the physical footprint of the courthouse, because I think we need to take this story that is sitting so neatly tucked away behind Dundas, but yet it's actually on Dundas where you're going to have the greatest exposure. So even though the archaeological dig and the courthouse doesn't touch Dundas, I would argue that we need to make sure that the history of the ward has to go to Dundas, which of course was a natural extension anyways, because that was the boundary of, heading up and heading north, the boundary of the ward.
I worked with John Lawrence. We started from one newspaper article, but we decided to do a book on the ward, and the book was a first shot at trying to understand what we thought was going to be a very rich and complex topic. And we knew the book wouldn't solve, we actually I fought pretty heavy against sort of saying, here's the history of the ward, because I thought, frankly, we haven't scratched the surface. That's maybe an archaeological pun, I'm not sure. But we hadn't scratched the surface. We didn't actually know the full extent. We knew there was valuable material that was unrecognized, largely by the City of Toronto. And my take on it is to look at things as alternate histories. I think we build history as a kind of foundation. We say, this is what our community is all about. And I've always been astonished by how bleak that history is in terms of the richness of what I understand the city to be. And the fact that there's so many different communities that aren't represented in our history. And I think Councillor just mentioned the Aboriginal communities. It's hard to find anything written about Aboriginal communities in Toronto that's available to the public, easily accessible. Also just the history of the ward itself, the history of the various communities that lived there. And in doing the book, we thought what we really wanted to do was get people thinking about issues like poverty, immigration, racism, race, diversity. We wanted to, because we thought, as much as if we can look at our history and our past, that we might actually be able to understand where we are right now, make some comparisons, make some decisions about ideas about what we understand our city to be about. So that was the idea of alternate histories. The book we did was very short little clips of different kind of positions from people, different voices. There was no attempt to kind of tie it all together because we didn't think that was possible. Also with history, you can think of two things. You can think of what we call intangible and tangible histories. And so intangible histories are things you can't get your hands around. You know them as they're oral, there's fleeting glimpses of them. They don't have strong tangible presence. And when we wrote the Ward book, we worked on the Ward book, and by the way, Tatum and Ellen were the other two editors of the book. When we worked on it as a team, what we were really thinking we were looking at was intangible things. We had photographs, that's all we had, and the photographs are so tantalizingly beautiful to sort of look at these things and think, well, that's the history, but who knows how to connect that stuff? Then we started to actually meet people and say, they point out the photograph and they say, that's my grandfather. So we started to make those kinds of connections. But with this archaeological project, all of a sudden we found tangible evidence of what we regarded as intangible history. And I think that's the incredible value of archaeology. And as sitting here tonight, I was thinking, gosh, where's the Museum of Toronto? Where is the ability to demonstrate these many artifacts, which have a tangible presence, which I think is what archaeology does for me. I'm not like there's some fantastic archaeologists in the room right now, but my sense of it as a person experiencing archaeology is you can actually see things as real artifacts and make actual connections to those artifacts emotionally.
Yeah, I was the person who cried. Yeah, I absolutely was, because when I was there, I really did feel the presence of people who had gone before, the people upon whose shoulders I have done what I have been able to do over time as a volunteer to further aspects of African Canadian history and heritage. The BME Church is an interesting phenomenon. It has branches that extended across Ontario into Nova Scotia, as well as the British Guyana, Danish West Indies, and Bermuda. In Chatham, Ontario, the very first BME church, as you already heard, was created. And it was incorporated or became a conference in 1856. Time goes by. This is the mother church of the British Methodist Episcopal Church of Canada. And beautiful artwork was created on the interior of the Chatham Church by artist Lane, who's gone on to be an incredibly famous artist in the United States, who hails from Chatham, who's done work for well, you'll have to Google her. Work was done by the BME Church to have this site designated a historic site. It was so designated. But unfortunately, that designation did not save it from ultimate destruction, not so very long afterwards. So that's one BME experience. Another BME experience took place April the 16th, 1998. And on April the 16th, 1998, just after Easter, the BME Church on Shaw Street didn't burn to the ground, but was torched, was on fire, was destroyed, was lost to us, and a number of other churches around the same point in time were lost to us. The church later moved ultimately to its current location, which is at the corner of Dufferin and Eglinton. So the church continues. Now what I want to just share with you is that my mother was the very last person who remained alive, who had attended the BME Church on Chestnut Street and the BME Church at Dufferin, at Shaw Street, and then again the one now at Dufferin and Eglinton. My mother was related to Thomas Jackson. Thomas Jackson was the last presiding minister of the BME Church on Chestnut Street. And while he died before I really ever could have the opportunity to know him, I mention this to you because it isn't so very long ago that there were people who were in positions of authority that were connected to this site. The BME Church on Chestnut Street is probably home, probably visited by, probably supported by people such as Frederick Douglass, people who are part of the reason that we have celebrated February as Black History Month, because it was in part to honor his birth date. The BME Church has been the home of the African Canadian community, and it is the longest lasting African Canadian owned and operated institution in Canada.
And just within the last year, I've come across new discoveries just by virtue of some of the projects I've worked at through my heritage consulting firm. So one of my clients is the Toronto Golf Club. They're the oldest golf club in Ontario. It's a private club. And the early members were from Scotland, and they were quite affluent, and they worked for the banks and the railroad. And when I was doing some genealogical research for a virtual product they're working on, I found out that several of them resided in the ward, and they were associated with Holy Trinity Church. And I thought, oh, another connection to the ward. And we left out the wealthiest citizens. They were mentioned in John's introductory piece, but for the most part, we were focusing on the ethnic groups and the working class citizens. And then recently I've been working on interactive exhibit for Canada's Immigration Museum Pier 21. And one of the groups we're looking at are Lebanese peddlers who came to Canada in the 1880s. And we don't know a lot about them, but they settled in many different provinces. And when I looked them up in the ward, there they were. And so I'd like to write a piece, now that I've already done the written work for this display, on the Lebanese peddlers who were in the ward from the 1890s until the early part of the last century. And the final group that is close to my heart, because I was the director of the Jewish Archives for close to a decade, is the Jewish community. Unlike some of the others, like the Lebanese peddlers who probably represented maybe 5-10 families, the Jewish community was there for several decades, and in 1910 they composed about 80% of the population. And when I was looking at the residents and the businesses that are in the area that is where the dig is taking place, it's just amazing. There's 5 synagogues, and there's all these small shtibels, which are mini synagogues in people's living rooms. And then you have a couple synagogues right outside, like Gol Sedek, which is on University. You have a lot of businesses. People worked for Eaton's, and there's tailors, and there was even the community pharmacist who lived in the neighborhood. And his name was Benjamin Hashmal. And he created the first Jewish dispensary in the neighborhood. They were wary of going to the hospitals, like the Children's Hospital, and they wanted their own hospital where they could speak Yiddish and be understood, and have kosher food if they were staying there. And so the Jewish dispensary catered to the Jewish community, and Hashmal was the founder, and he lived there. So hopefully something will come up in the artifacts, maybe some bottles or something. There were also some Jewish soda manufacturers and bottle factories, so those might come up as well. And so I'm very curious and excited to see what discoveries Holly will have, because she said this is the tip of the iceberg.
For those who know me, for those people who know me, they would know that I would not miss the opportunity in front of 300 people or so to talk about one of the least positive issues about archaeology, not only in Toronto, but in Ontario. There is no other Western jurisdiction where the material culture recovered in such an important and historically significant block such as this would be left to the devices of the archaeologist, no matter how well-intentioned and how well-funded we might be to store that material. And I'm talking about myself, Polly, every archaeologist in this room. That is the case in Ontario. We are responsible for these artifacts. Wherever our offices are, we will be overwhelmed, and I'm sure Polly would agree, she's overwhelmed in her offices in London by the tremendous wealth that this place has. How is it possible that we have a province in which this material is left to us to look after? It is in the public interest that, subject to the wishes of the true owners of these objects, that they reside in facilities designed to care for them and make them available to the public. As a beginning, I would hope that these tens of thousands of objects that Holly and her team have found, each object, as Holly poignantly pointed out, with a story of its own, will eventually reside in the appropriate public facility in Toronto.
They worked on that particularly in the context of the United States, and on this question of the difference between monuments and memorials, the difference, the way in which monument making and thinking about the making of monuments changes after the 19th century, after a time when more and more people had the right, or were beginning to get the right to have their histories and their stories told. Because as we know from philosophers like Walter Benjamin, the history of monuments really before our time was a history of the victors over the vanquished, right? So what we're seeing in a site like this, and the struggle and the thinking about how to commemorate properly here, is how you deal with a succession of histories, with a cosmopolitan situation where many people have lived here, and their histories need to be told, but their histories are in some ways competing. And in this sense, I want to come back to something that Kristyn Wong-Tam said, which was that the courthouse will have the responsibility to have an architecture which is neutral. Well, one of the things that monument making reveals is there is no such thing as a neutral architecture. There is no such thing as an architecture or an artifact or a monument or memorial which can be entirely neutral in the way in which it tells and retells history. So my own work in this area actually started, I think, when I was a student, when I read this book by David Lowenthal, called The Past is a Foreign Country. I don't know how many of you know this book, but I would recommend it to all of you. It actually comes from a quote by, from a novel by J.P. Hartley called The Go-Between. And what I started to think about when I read that, and what was revealed to me is the way that we tell histories and tell our own histories and the histories of others is a way of actually opening up a horizon to the future. So I think what's important here, and what the struggle around design and architecture will be, is that first of all, even the design of the courthouse is not something which can shy away from dealing with the history of the site and actually the contemporary challenges we face in Toronto, which is a highly diverse city and a cosmopolitan place. What is fascinating about the history of this site is it shows that this is not a new condition.